get two service managers together talking shop, you hear some pretty good tips. Take the other day, for instance. I was in to see Walt Majors. He's a Chrysler Plymouth service manager.
And we like the new reference books, too, Tech. Hey, look who's coming in. That's Ernie Hawkins, the service manager from the Dodge dealership down the street. Wonder what he wants.
Hi, Walt. Just thought I'd drop in. Maybe we can swap a few service ideas.
Fine, Ernie, but let's step into my office and be comfortable.
This electric heater feels good. And that reminds me, what kind of winter road service calls have you been getting?
You know, the biggest single problem is owners who don't take time for periodic battery service. They just don't realize that when it's below freezing, a battery puts out about half its normal cranking power, even when it's fully charged. So the battery's usually the first thing we check on any hard starting complaint.
Here's a point to remember on road service calls as well as in the shop. Whenever you use a booster battery to start an engine with an alternator, be sure you connect the leads correctly, or you'll ruin the charging system wiring and possibly the rectifiers.
Keeping the battery clean saves a lot of trouble. We wet them down, sprinkle baking soda on them, and scrub them with a brush to get rid of dirt and electrolyte deposits.
Over at our shop, we pour a little ammonia over the battery and use warm water to flush all those deposits away.
Either method's okay, but be sure you don't let any cleaning solution get into the battery cells.
And even if the cable connections look all right, we always clean the battery posts and cable terminals. Sometimes a corroded bolt will keep you from tightening the clamp enough to get a good electrical contact. We check that, too. Of course, we coat the terminals to protect against corrosion.
For testing batteries, you can't get along without a good hydrometer, one with a built-in thermometer for temperature corrections.
And keep it clean. Use soapy water and be sure to rinse it thoroughly before you use it. Soap may damage the battery.
If there's a specific gravity variation between cells, we make a capacity test to find out if the battery can be saved. But I guess I don't have to tell you how to test a battery.
We do a pretty good job on battery service. Besides, we have practically no battery troubles with our certified car care customers. It's the backsliders that account for most of our emergency service calls. But before we get off the subject, here's an idea. If you suspect tiny cracks in the battery case, clean it. Then use your battery tester voltmeter to find them. Connect one voltmeter lead to the matching battery post and set the selector switch on the lowest voltage scale. Just watch the needle as you move the other meter lead around the battery case.
I suppose you could use the voltmeter to demonstrate self-discharge across the top of the battery.
Sure enough. That's how we prove to customers that the battery carrier, and cables should be cleaned.
That's a good idea, Ernie. Now I think we've covered batteries pretty well, so let's compare notes on ignition service.
There's a good place to start, the distributor cap. Dirt and grease here will hold moisture and cause a high voltage leak. Then you've got hard starting, poor acceleration, and other complaints. The best way we've found to correct this is to scrub the cap inside and out with a solution of household detergent and water. Rinse it with hot water and dry it thoroughly. Then inspect it for carbon tracks, corroded terminals, and signs of arcing.
Use a clean cloth to dry the cap. Compressed air might contain traces of oil, dirt, or water that could cause the same trouble all over again. And I hope you always clean the coil tower, too.
We do, Tech. In addition, when the cap's off, we inspect the breaker points. If they're burned blue, we test the voltage regulator setting first. Then we test the condenser for series resistance, capacity, and insulation breakdown. When removing resistance-type ignition cables, we use a twisting motion. We don't take any chances on stretching the core and increasing the resistance.
When installing ignition cables, we pinch the boot to release trapped air. And when we replace a coil high-tension lead, we use the new cable package listed in the parts book. In damp weather, we found it gives good protection against secondary voltage leaks.
Speaking of ignition cables, I hope neither of you uses engine test equipment with cable connectors that puncture the cable insulation.
Oh, no, Tech. All our equipment has adapters for connecting to the ignition cables.
Same with ours, Tech. We realize that you can't damage that insulation and expect it to do its job.
Absolutely, Ernie. And now maybe I can give you two guys some pointers in case you ever get a repair job on the new gear reduction cranking motor. The outer spring on the solenoid switch fits into a pocket in the brush holder plate. If it slips out of its pocket or off the plunger during reassembly, it could be ruined. And so could the switch contact.
I suppose that if the spring is damaged, the solenoid switch might stick closed, causing the cranking motor to keep running?
That's right, Walt. Now, here's another tip. Always bend the solenoid leads away from the switch contact disc during reassembly. If they touch the disc, they'll short out, causing the motor to crank, even with the ignition off.
We'll watch for those points, Tech. Say, I noticed that the shift fork pin is installed so that its longer end can be bent away from the housing flange to prevent possible interference.
Right, Ernie. And remember this. Never replace the pin with an ordinary cotter pin. Use only the correct replacement part.
Okay, Tech. And I suppose it's a good idea to be sure the pin fits freely in the housing and to oil it before installation, too.
Yes, that's important. And while you're at it, put just a bit of oil between the two halves of the shift fork as well. And don't ever tighten the two rivets, because there must be some side play in the fork so it will operate properly.
When you install the cranking motor, I imagine it would be advisable to make sure the seal spacer between the cranking motor and the engine is okay.
Right, Walt. A damaged seal could affect the pinion-to-ring gear clearance, giving an abnormal gear noise during cranking. And now, if there's nothing more on electrical subjects, let's go...
Not so fast, Tech, before we leave that subject. There's a related problem on early 62 Plymouths I'd like to show Ernie. Although not electrical, strictly speaking, it does concern servicing an important part of an electrical system. Aiming the inner headlamps, to be exact. And proper headlamp adjustment is particularly important this time of year. On early 62 Plymouths, these inner headlamp doors cover the adjustment screws. If you just remove the doors to aim the headlamps, the adjustment could be distorted when the doors are put back. So, instead, we file access slots at the adjustment screw locations on each door. Then, we adjust the screws after putting the doors back in place.
There's a similar condition on early 62 Dodges, Walt. We correct it by cutting an access notch in the tops of the two inner headlamp doors. In addition, we file a slot in the left side of the inner left sealed beam housing only. Then we drill 3 access holes in the grill to line up with these openings. We also enlarge the 3 mounting holes in each sealed beam shell for more adjustment travel. And finally, to protect the 2 inner sealed beam units from shock damage when closing the hood, we put a couple of layers of electrical tape on the positioning nubs.
In either case, be sure to hold the doors in your hand while you're filing or cutting the access slots. Don't put them in a vise, or you might bend the parts or damage the finish. And speaking of finishes, this side of the record's finished right now. Well, you've both come up with good ideas on electrical subjects, but what about some other categories? Like automatic choke operation, for instance.
We've found there's one way to keep that from becoming a problem. Consistent preventive maintenance. On any carburetor having the choke valve vacuum unloader piston in the air horn, for example, it's essential to flush out the choke piston cylinder with carburetor cleaner at frequent intervals. To do this, we warm up the engine and let it idle. Then, we squirt some carburetor cleaner through the piston link opening inside the air horn while we wiggle the choke valve back and forth to help the cleaner flush out any gum deposits that would keep the choke from working properly.
Sometimes on higher mileage cars, Walt, this condition reaches a point where we have to remove the choke piston and clean it. Then we use it as a plunger to help clean the cylinder.
Good point, Ernie. Incidentally, this condition can be diagnosed only when the engine's cold. When it's warmed up, the gum deposits soften, and the choke usually works okay. But as the engine cools down, the gum solidifies and holds the choke valve open. Whenever possible, we park the car out in the cold for a few hours. Then we remove the air cleaner and open the throttle to release the fast idle cam. If the choke valve sticks open, gum deposits are probably the cause. If the choke valve stays open, we just push it lightly toward its closed position. If gum is the problem, the piston should break free quite easily. However, the gum's got to be cleaned out or the sticking will be repeated with every cooling cycle.
Of course, that's not always the trouble, Walt. On some 1960 and early 61 slant 6 engines, you've got to be sure there's clearance between the choke lever and the air cleaner. If we find interference there, we raise the air cleaner by installing an extra air cleaner gasket.
And it's important to test the manifold heat control valve periodically. Since this valve controls the temperature of the fuel-air mixture entering the cylinders, it has a direct effect on choke operation, engine performance, and economy.
We test the valve with the engine off by turning the counterweight back and forth against the tension of the spring. It should turn freely and return to the closed position. If the counterweight moves sluggishly, or doesn't move at all, the shaft's probably binding. If there's no return to the closed position, a weak or broken thermostatic spring is indicated.
You can also test the valve by momentarily gunning the engine after it's warmed up, then releasing the throttle quickly. The valve counterweight should open quickly and snap back to the closed position. Of course, you know that manifold heat control valve solvent can be used to loosen a binding shaft. Apply the solvent to both ends of the shaft and be sure the valve is cool, not hot, or the solvent will evaporate before it can do its job. Turn the counterweight back and forth to work the solvent in and free up the shaft. And if it's an unusually stubborn case, you can tap the end of the shaft lightly a few times to jar it loose after you've applied the solvent. That usually cures the stubborn one.
Sure does, Ernie. And I might add, we've found that checking for these 3 items, a gummed-up choke piston, interference at the choke lever, and a binding manifold heat control valve, eliminates most of our so-called automatic choke adjustment problems.
Right. And a lot of other problems can be prevented by good workmanship and the certified car care program. For instance, on every tune-up job, our technicians check battery condition, the manifold heat control valve, the distributor cap, and the choke piston.
So do we, Ernie. In addition, we take time to measure accelerator pump travel and adjust it if necessary. And in temperature extremes, it's particularly important to set curb and fast idle correctly.
Of course, we check the carburetor air horn screws and mounting stud nuts for tightness. It's also a good idea to be sure the intake manifold bolts are tight. Air leaks at any of those places would give a lean mixture. We don't overlook the chance of an air leak at power brake connections or heater vacuum actuators either.
Sounds like you two are real serious about keeping customers happy.
We are. And it pays off. Checking safety items pays off, too. For instance, we look for exhaust system leaks and defective windshield wipers. We also inspect lights, tires, brakes, and steering. Customers like this, and you'd be surprised at the number of parts and service sales we make that would be lost otherwise.
That's true, Walt. Safety items are important, and so is customer comfort. And that brings us around to heater operation. Got anything interesting on that subject?
A few points, Ernie. As you know, good heater operation depends upon 3 factors: coolant temperature, coolant circulation, and air circulation. So let's take them in that order.
Okay, Walt. On the subject of coolant temperature, we still find an occasional car with a low temperature thermostat and low boiling point antifreeze installed. We do our best to sell the owners on using a 180-degree thermostat and permanent antifreeze. This not only gives them more heat, but it retards the formation of sludge in their engine oil as well.
Right. And of course, a thermostat can fail and result in a no heat complaint. To be on the safe side, we check coolant temperature. Now, when it comes to coolant circulation, we've learned quite a bit about the temperature control valve that regulates the coolant flow through the heater. For example, if the heater valve isn't closing or the heater isn't putting out enough heat, the first thing we check is the cable adjustment. The trouble's more apt to be there than in the valve itself. The same thing holds true when it takes extra effort to move the temperature control lever at the instrument panel. Before we test the valve for binding, we take a minute to see if the cable's kinked or routed incorrectly. These tips have saved unnecessary valve replacement jobs.
Yes, and we found it's usually not necessary to replace the valve if it's noisy either. A buzzing noise in the valve, for example, can be caused by air or combustion gases in the coolant. For a quick check, we look for bubbles or foaming in the top tank of the radiator with the engine running. If we find this condition, we inspect the entire cooling system for air leaks, paying particular attention to the hose and its connections at the suction side of the water pump. Then we always test for combustion gases in the coolant, too.
Right. That's very important. If a combustion gas leak is caught in time, you could save an engine overhaul.
Here's another noise possibility. If the heater hose connections are reversed at the valve, it'll make a clattering noise at higher speeds. When this happens, water pressure will close the valve and there'll be little or no heat from the heater. So be sure the hoses are routed correctly.
Those are good tips, Ernie. But now let's cover some air circulation conditions in that new heater system that's used in our Plymouths and in your Dodges, too. We've found that cold air leaks in this system usually come from 3 causes. Occasionally, we find the rubber grommet for the blower motor wires out of place. If so, we just pull the wires out gently till we can reach the grommet with needle nose pliers. Then, we work the grommet into position with the pliers, being careful not to damage the wires. Also, we make sure the flexible hose between the air inlet and the blower motor housing is properly installed and clamped at both ends. The carpet or floor mat must be under the retainer on the heater housing. If it's out of place, it could prevent the heater deflector from moving all the way into the heat position. Then some of the air will bypass the heater core and come out as cold as it went in. And while we're checking the deflector, we make sure the heat vent deflector linkage operates properly so that the deflector seals tightly when it's in the heat position.
Those are all good tips, fellas. Mighty important, too, when you realize that a cold car sure makes a customer hot under the collar.
Right, Tech. And it's not easy to simmer 'em down without having 'em cool off on your service either.
Yes, that's true. Winter is a rough season on cars, and on customers, too. So this is the time of year when extra effort on everyone's part to build customer satisfaction and goodwill really pays off big. Although parts of this session covered those little details that many of you technicians already know about, just remember, it's little details like these that add up to good service departments. And that's what we're all working for.